Now, we talk to MPs an awful lot on this radio station, and we talk to some very good MPs and some not so very good MPs. There are, of course, some who are worth their weight in gold and others not so much. But it now turns out that according to a piece in the papers today, that the Taxpayers Alliance are showing, average MP now costs you £240,000 a year. You wouldn't be surprised to learn, for example, that the total cost of Ian Blackford from the SNP, £243,275 is what he's cost us. So the next time you hear him saying that Scotland has been ignored by England, by the government in Westminster, and that nobody in Scotland gets any money from the UK purse, I think you'll find £250,000 is not a bad start, Mr. Blackford. Let us talk now to Joe Ventry, Digital Campaign Manager at the Taxpayers Alliance. Joe, very good morning to you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for having me on.
This is a great study. I always like to see hard facts put in front of people when they find out quite how much their MPs cost. Interesting that your studies found that Matt Hancock was the most expensive MP in the Cabinet, total cost of £225,305, because with a lot of cabinet jobs comes an awful lot of staff. So, I mean, most of these guys, I'm sure, will say, oh, yeah, well, it's all for our office staff and it's for our stationery costs and all of that. I mean, if you're a minister in the Cabinet, you shouldn't have that many costs, should you?
Well, exactly. And I mean, if we look at the bigger picture here as well, what we're seeing across the board is a 6.5% increase to the total cost of MPs to taxpayers, which is, it's really quite considerable. And I mean, it would be astronomical, I think, to a lot of, to me and you and to your listeners as well, to think of some of these figures. But I think ultimately this should serve as a reminder to MPs that, whilst they're privy to these massive expenses, which they, in many cases do need to perform their duties, they have a responsibility to use them prudently and to be able to justify them to taxpayers as well.
Well, I think that's right, because whenever I look into sort of an individual MP's expenses, you can always find things that they really shouldn't be claiming for. And I know, for example, that, stationery can add up, and I know that stationery... But I mean, given that last year in particular, most of the MPs weren't even in the chamber because of the COVID situation, I mean, how is it that their costs haven't gone down?
Well, I suppose we must caveat this with the fact that these numbers released by IPSA yesterday were actually for the financial year of 2019 to 2020. So a lot of the COVID crisis there itself is cut out. But, again, we are seeing that trend increase. And as we face this situation that we're going through now, it really should be a wake-up call to MPs that we need to get the situation under control.
Well, it really should, because it was only recently, wasn't it, that there was another vote to give them even more money, a pay rise indeed. And they always say, that old chestnut, that, it's nothing to do with us. It's all to do with the parliamentary standards people. They decide on the increase that we should be getting. And I think in the end, they didn't get it. But there's a sort of a sense, if you like, that they're very much out of touch with ordinary people. Because, I mean, most people listening to these numbers, I mean, look at this. Roger Godsiff, Labour, 265,660. I think he's top of the league. Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker, £259,057. I mean, these are eye-watering figures, the sort of money that an awful lot of people would probably take 10 years to make.
Well, that's quite right. And, again, we must expect that, MPs do need significant expenses to perform their duties. But, I mean, that's what makes it all the better that we have organisations like ourselves, the Taxpayers Alliance. We have entities like talkRADIO that are willing to look into these figures and scrutinise them and hold MPs to account.
Well, yes, because I mean, I'm not sure what month it goes from goes to into 2020, but I'd be very interested to see what the figures are for the bulk of last year in terms of travelling, because even in terms of travelling costs, I mean, of course, Ian Blackford's going to cost more money, I suppose, than a London MP in terms of his travelling costs, because he comes from a very far north part of Scotland. However, he wouldn't have been travelling as much, because we've seen him on his Zoom calls from his man cave up there in Scotland quite often when he's at Prime Minister's questions. So his costs surely will come down.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose we'll have that to look forward to next year, won't we? But, just looking at the wider picture there, as you said, of travel and sustenance expenses as well. These are areas where we know that MPs have a sort of lot of control in terms of where they can keep costs down. And particularly going into this year as well, where we know the public finances are in such a dire state, this really should serve as a reminder that then these costs need to be kept down to a minimum as possible.
And according to your study here, around 98 MPs, 12% of the total, chose to stay in hotels when in London last year. A total of £718,000, 733 was spent on hotel claims. I mean, I suppose that's marginally better than lots of them getting second homes and furnishing those second homes and then doing very well by selling those second homes on. But I don't imagine that they would be cheap hotels they were staying in.
Well, no, perhaps not. But I mean, again, this is why we need to all look into the granular detail and take an interest in these details so that we can question these things. And ultimately, then the MPs will have to answer to us as to why these costs were justified.
No, quite. I mean, one of the other stories that we were going to do, actually, I think towards the end of last week that we didn't get around to doing, was this ridiculous situation in the House of Lords where apparently all members of the House of Lords have been given a free laptop to the tune of something like £100,000 because they're working from home. Now, I don't know about you, but I mean, what we know about the House of Lords is an awful lot of people in the House of Lords don't bother turning up for work as a general rule anyway, and probably even fewer of them now turn up for work virtually.
Well, many taxpayers will already see the House of Lords as an entity which is in many ways too big, opaque and quite expensive. But in the same way that MPs have justified expenses for their roles, the same can be said for Lords. And obviously it needs to be taken into account that they can work sufficiently from home. But at the same time, as you said, it's a case of keeping these costs down to as minimum as possible. And TPA research last year actually highlighted that the Home Office has 2,300 unused laptops sitting around. So it's it really serves as a reminder that if there were a concerted effort in the public sector to really sort of distribute these devices, it would be another way that the cost can be taken away from taxpayers.
Yeah. Also, you're not going to tell me that that people who work in the House of Lords are in need of being given a new or a free laptop when they don't have one themselves already.
Well, indeed. And again, I mean, it's a case where we need to really look into the granular detail and hold the Lords to account. And if they can justify the costs, then so be it. But I mean, it's a case, again, of keeping those costs to a minimum as much as possible and being able to justify it for the taxpayers who pay for them.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Joe, thanks very much indeed. Joe Venture, Digital Campaign Manager, Taxpayers Alliance. This is a great piece, this, and I would recommend that you go and look at it and go and find the Taxpayers Alliance website as well, because you'll be able to find out exactly what your Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority MP is actually claiming.